The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the sterile military briefing room as dozens of officers shuffled into their seats. The air was thick with tension and the familiar scent of strong coffee that had been brewing since dawn. Outside, the desert heat of Kandahar airfield shimmered against the windows, but, inside, the atmosphere was cold and professional. Major Sarah Chen adjusted her medical bag one final time before taking her seat in the third row. Her Navy SEAL medic insignia caught the light as she moved, a small but significant detail that distinguished her from the sea of Army uniforms surrounding her. At 28, she had already earned more commendations than officers twice her age, but she wore her achievements quietly, preferring to let her work speak for itself. The room fell silent as General Marcus Hawthorne strode through the entrance, his polished boots clicking against the concrete floor with military precision. Everything about the man screamed authority, from his perfectly pressed uniform to the steely gray eyes that seemed to catalog every face in the room. Behind him followed a small entourage of aides, each carrying tablets and briefing materials that would shape the next phase of their mission. Hawthorne had built his reputation on results, but also on an iron-fisted approach that left little room for what he considered weakness or insubordination. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried the weight of 3 decades in the military and enough battlefield experience to command instant respect from even the most seasoned veterans. "Ladies and gentlemen," the general began, his voice cutting through the room like a blade, "today we discuss Operation Desert Shield, a mission that will test every skill you've developed and every ounce of courage you possess." He paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. "This is not a training exercise. Lives hang in the balance, and I expect nothing less than perfection from each of you." Sarah listened intently as Hawthorne outlined the mission parameters. A convoy of American civilians, including several aid workers and journalists, had been captured by insurgents in a remote mountain region. Intelligence suggested they were being held in a fortified compound approximately 60 miles northeast of their current position. The rescue operation would require precise coordination between multiple units, including air support, ground assault teams, and medical personnel. As the briefing continued, Sarah's trained eye caught details that others might miss. The satellite imagery showed a compound with multiple buildings, narrow escape routes, and what appeared to be heavy fortification around the perimeter. Her medical training kicked in as she mentally calculated potential casualty scenarios, evacuation routes, and the supplies she would need to treat wounded personnel in a hostile environment. "The assault will commence at 0400 hours, Hawthorne continued, pointing to the projected map with his laser pointer. "Alpha Team will breach the northern perimeter while Bravo Team provides overwatch from the ridgeline. Medical support will establish a forward aid station here." He indicated a position roughly half a mile from the target compound. Sarah frowned slightly. The proposed location for the medical station seemed unnecessarily distant from the action. In her experience with SEAL operations, having medical support closer to the point of engagement could mean the difference between life and death for wounded operators. She had seen too many good soldiers die not from their wounds, but from the precious minutes lost in transport to medical care. The general continued outlining the operation, detailing everything from radio frequencies to contingency plans for various scenarios. His presentation was thorough and professionally delivered, but Sarah noticed something troubling in his approach. The plan seemed to prioritize minimizing political risk over maximizing the chances of a successful rescue. The proposed timeline was aggressive, almost recklessly so, and the margin for error was razor-thin. When Hawthorne opened the floor for questions, several officers raised concerns about logistics and timing. Each question was answered with clinical precision, but also with an undertone that suggested further inquiry would not be welcome. The general's reputation for brooking no dissent was well known throughout the command structure, and most officers chose their words carefully when addressing him directly. Sarah raised her hand, her movement confident but respectful. "Sir, regarding the medical support position, I'd like to suggest an alternative placement that would reduce casualty evacuation time by approximately 12 minutes. She stood as she spoke, her voice clear and professional. Based on the terrain analysis and expected engagement patterns, positioning medical support at grid reference 774 Alpha would provide better coverage while maintaining adequate safety margins." The room fell silent. Several officers turned to look at Sarah, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed concern for what they perceived as a challenge to the general's authority. Hawthorne's expression remained neutral, but there was something in his eyes that suggested her input was not particularly welcome. "Major Chen," the general replied, his tone measured but carrying an edge that everyone in the room could detect, "I appreciate your enthusiasm. However, the medical support position has been determined based on analysis from personnel with significantly more experience in planning operations of this scope and complexity." The dismissal was clear, but Sarah pressed on, motivated by genuine concern for the welfare of the personnel who would be executing this mission. "Sir, with respect, my experience in direct action missions with SEAL teams has shown that medical support positioning can be critical to mission success. The proposed location may be tactically sound from a general planning perspective, but it doesn't account for the specific medical challenges we're likely to encounter." Hawthorne's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. In his mind, the young major was overstepping her bounds, questioning decisions that had been made by officers with far more operational planning experience. He had dealt with subordinates who thought they knew better than their commanders before, and he had little patience for what he viewed as misplaced confidence. "Major," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "I'm not sure you understand the full scope of this operation or the level of planning that has gone into every aspect of it. Perhaps you should focus on ensuring your medical supplies are properly inventoried rather than attempting to redesign an operation that has been carefully crafted by experienced professionals." The rebuke stung, but Sarah maintained her composure. She had been in enough high-stress situations to know that emotional reactions rarely led to productive outcomes. Still, she felt compelled to make one more attempt to communicate her concerns, driven by her oath to do everything possible to preserve life. "Sir, I understand the complexity of the operation," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "My concern is specifically related to casualty care and evacuation procedures. In similar operations I've supported, we've found that positioning medical support closer to the point of engagement can significantly improve survival rates for wounded personnel." Around the room, other officers watched the exchange with growing discomfort. Everyone knew that Hawthorne's reputation was built not just on tactical competence, but on his expectation of absolute deference from subordinates. The fact that a relatively junior officer was continuing to press her point was unprecedented in most of their experience. Hawthorne stepped closer to Sarah's position, his presence intimidating even from several feet away. "Major Chen, let me be absolutely clear about something. I have been planning and executing military operations since before you enlisted. I have commanded troops in combat situations that tested every aspect of military doctrine and procedure. When I decide on operational parameters, it is based on years of experience and extensive consultation with subject matter experts." He paused, letting his words hang in the air before continuing. "Your job is to provide medical support according to the plan that has been established. It is not to question the strategic or tactical decisions made by your superiors. Is that understood?" Sarah felt the weight of every eye in the room upon her. She knew that her response in this moment would likely define not just her relationship with the general, but potentially her entire career trajectory. The smart move, the politically safe move, would be to acknowledge his authority and drop the matter entirely. But, as she stood there, she thought about the soldiers who would be risking their lives in just a few hours. She thought about the wounded who might die not because their injuries were unsurvivable, but because help was just a few minutes too far away. Her medical training and her oath to preserve life compelled her to make one final attempt. "Sir, I understand and respect your authority completely," she began, choosing her words with extreme care. "However, I also have a professional responsibility to advocate for the best possible medical support for our personnel. I'm not questioning your tactical judgment, but rather asking if we might consider medical positioning as a separate variable that could be optimized without affecting other aspects of the operation." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Hawthorne's expression hardened into something approaching anger, though he maintained his professional demeanor. From his perspective, this junior officer was not just questioning his judgment, but doing so in front of a room full of subordinates, undermining his authority at a critical moment before a major operation. Other officers in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some admired Sarah's courage in advocating for what she believed was right, while others worried that she was making a career-ending mistake. The tension was palpable as everyone waited to see how the general would respond to what many perceived as a direct challenge to his command authority. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, Sarah's immediate superior, caught her eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head, trying to signal that she should discontinue this line of discussion. But Sarah's focus remained on the general, waiting for his response while mentally preparing for whatever consequences might follow. The briefing room had become a stage for a confrontation that went beyond the specific details of medical positioning. It was a clash between hierarchy and expertise, between traditional command structure and the reality that sometimes junior personnel might have insights that could save lives. As the silence stretched on, everyone in the room understood that they were witnessing a moment that would have consequences far beyond the immediate mission planning session. General Hawthorne's jaw clenched as he processed what he perceived as continued insubordination from Major Chen. The silence in the briefing room stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap at any moment. His reputation had been built on decisive leadership and unwavering authority, and he was not about to let a junior officer undermine that foundation, regardless of her credentials or intentions. "Major Chen," he began, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet tone that somehow carried more threat than shouting ever could. "I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about your role in this operation and your place in this command structure." He took a step closer, his imposing frame casting a shadow over Sarah's position. "When I give an operational directive, it is not a suggestion open for debate. It is not a rough draft waiting for improvement from subordinates who think they know better." Sarah maintained her composure, though she could feel her heart rate increasing. She had faced enemy fire with less stress than she was experiencing in this moment. Around the room, officers who had initially been focused on the mission briefing now found themselves unwilling witnesses to what was becoming a very public disciplinary action. "Your SEAL experience," Hawthorne continued, emphasizing the words with a tone that bordered on mockery, "while perhaps impressive in certain limited contexts, does not qualify you to redesign operations planned by officers with decades of strategic experience." His eyes swept the room, making sure his message was being received not just by Sarah, but by every person present. "The Navy may have different standards for questioning authority, but, in my command, orders are followed without argument." Lieutenant Colonel Martinez shifted uncomfortably in his seat, recognizing that the situation was escalating beyond a simple disagreement about tactical positioning. As Sarah's immediate superior, he felt caught between supporting his subordinate and maintaining his own standing with the general. The political dynamics of military hierarchy were playing out in real time, and everyone in the room understood that careers could be made or destroyed in the next few minutes. Sarah took a deep breath before responding, knowing that her next words would be crucial. "General, I want to be absolutely clear that I have complete respect for your command authority and extensive experience. I was not attempting to question your judgment or redesign the operation. As a medical officer, I was simply trying to provide input on medical-specific considerations that might not have been fully explored during the planning process." Her voice remained steady, professional, and respectful, but there was an underlying strength that suggested she would not be easily intimidated. Several officers in the room found themselves grudgingly impressed by her composure under pressure, even as they worried about the consequences she might face for continuing to engage on this topic. Hawthorne's expression darkened further. From his perspective, every word Sarah spoke was another challenge to his authority, another public demonstration that his decisions were open to question by subordinates. He had commanded troops in some of the most dangerous environments on Earth, had made life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure, and had earned his position through decades of proven leadership. The idea that a junior officer would continue to press her point after being directly instructed to stand down was not just inappropriate, it was intolerable. "Major," he said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his authority and barely contained anger, "you seem to be operating under the misapprehension that your input was requested or that your concerns carry equal weight to the decisions made by this command staff." He gestured toward the other senior officers in the room. "Let me help you understand something about military command structure and professional conduct." The room had become completely silent except for the humming of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of aircraft operations outside. Every person present understood that they were witnessing something significant, a confrontation that would likely be discussed and analyzed for years to come. Some officers found themselves sympathetic to Sarah's position, recognizing the validity of her medical concerns, while others believed she had overstepped appropriate bounds regardless of her intentions. When Colonel Patterson and I developed this operational plan, Hawthorne continued, referring to his chief of staff, we consulted with medical personnel, logistics experts, intelligence analysts, and tactical specialists. The medical positioning was determined based on comprehensive analysis of multiple factors including terrain, enemy capabilities, extraction routes, and force protection requirements. His tone grew more condescending with each word. Your suggestion that we somehow overlooked critical medical considerations is both presumptuous and professionally inappropriate. Sarah felt a flush of anger rising in her chest, not at being corrected or even disciplined, but at the implication that her concerns were baseless or self-serving. She had spent years treating wounded soldiers in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, had held dying men in her arms while trying desperately to keep them alive long enough to reach proper medical facilities. Her suggestions were not born from arrogance or a desire to challenge authority, but from intimate knowledge of how those crucial minutes between injury and treatment could determine whether a soldier went home to his family or came home in a flag-draped coffin. Sir, she began, but Hawthorne cut her off with a sharp gesture. I am not finished, Major. His voice had risen slightly, and there was no mistaking the anger behind his professional facade. Your behavior today demonstrates a fundamental lack of understanding about military discipline and respect for the chain of command. In my experience, officers who cannot follow simple directives in a briefing room cannot be trusted to follow orders in combat situations. The implication was clear and devastating. Hawthorne was not just criticizing Sarah's input or disagreeing with her suggestions, he was questioning her competence as an officer and her reliability as a member of the team. Several officers in the room exchanged glances, recognizing the severity of what they were witnessing. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez finally felt compelled to intervene. General, if I may, he began carefully, Major Chen has an exemplary record of performance in combat situations. Her conduct today, while perhaps not following normal briefing protocols, seems to stem from genuine concern for personnel welfare rather than any disrespect for command authority. Hawthorne turned his steely gaze toward Martinez, clearly displeased at the interruption. Colonel, I appreciate your defense of your subordinate, but Major Chen is perfectly capable of speaking for herself. In fact, she seems quite determined to do so regardless of whether it's appropriate or requested. The barb was clearly intended for Sarah, but Martinez pressed on. Sir, I've worked with Major Chen on 3 previous operations, and her medical expertise has been invaluable. She's not questioning your tactical judgment, but rather offering specialized knowledge that might enhance our medical support capabilities. Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward her superior for his support, but she also recognized that his intervention might put his own career at risk. The politics of military hierarchy were complex and unforgiving, and officers who challenged or questioned their superiors, even indirectly, often found themselves facing consequences that extended far beyond the immediate situation. Hawthorne's response was swift and decisive. Colonel Martinez, I think it's clear that both you and Major Chen have lost sight of appropriate military bearing and respect for command decisions. The medical positioning has been finalized based on comprehensive analysis by qualified personnel. This discussion is closed. He turned back to Sarah, his expression now showing open hostility barely contained within the bounds of military professionalism. Major Chen, you will report to my office immediately following this briefing. We will have a private discussion about your conduct today and your future role in this command structure. The threat was unmistakable. Everyone in the room understood that being summoned to the general's office for a private discussion about conduct and future role was military speak for a career-ending conversation. Sarah felt her stomach drop, but she maintained her composure, knowing that showing weakness now would only make things worse. Furthermore, Hawthorne continued, his voice now carrying the tone of someone delivering a verdict, I want it clearly understood by everyone in this room that operational decisions made by this command staff are final. Questions about procedures or logistics should be addressed through proper channels and, at appropriate times, not during operational briefings in front of assembled personnel. He paused to let his words sink in before delivering what many in the room recognized as a deliberate humiliation. Major Chen, since you seem to have such strong opinions about medical positioning and procedures, you will be responsible for establishing the medical station at the designated coordinates and ensuring that it operates according to the specifications outlined in the operational plan. I trust you can handle that responsibility without further need for creative input." The assignment was clearly intended as punishment, relegating Sarah to following orders without question rather than participating in any meaningful way in operational planning. Several officers in the room shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the professional slight that had just been delivered. Sarah straightened her shoulders and looked directly at the general. "Yes, sir. I understand my responsibilities and will execute them according to your directives." Her voice was steady and professional, but there was something in her tone that suggested this confrontation was far from over. The briefing continued for another 20 minutes, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. Officers who had been actively engaged in the planning discussion now focused primarily on avoiding any appearance of questioning or challenging the general's directives. The free exchange of ideas that had characterized the beginning of the briefing had been replaced by careful deference and minimal input. As the session concluded and officers began filing out of the room, many cast sympathetic glances toward Sarah, but few dared to approach her directly. The consequences of being associated with someone who had publicly clashed with the general were too significant to risk, especially so close to a major operation. Sarah packed her briefing materials slowly, her mind racing as she processed what had just happened and considered her limited options moving forward. She knew that her career was now hanging by a thread, but she also knew that in a few hours, soldiers would be risking their lives, and her decisions could impact whether they came home alive. The desert sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when Sarah made her way to General Hawthorne's office, her footsteps echoing through the corridors of the command building. The weight of the afternoon's confrontation settled heavily on her shoulders as she mentally prepared for what would likely be the most difficult conversation of her military career. Other personnel she passed in the hallways offered subtle nods of acknowledgement, but she could see the caution in their eyes. Word of her public disagreement with the general had spread quickly through the base, as such news always did in tight-knit military communities. General Hawthorne's aide, a young sergeant with nervous energy, gestured toward the heavy wooden door marked with the general's nameplate and rank insignia. "The general is waiting for you, Major," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of respectful sympathy typically reserved for those heading toward their own execution. Sarah nodded her appreciation and knocked firmly on the door, her military bearing intact despite the circumstances. "Enter," came the sharp command from within. Sarah pushed open the door and stepped into an office that reflected its occupant's personality with military precision. Awards and commendations lined the walls, photographs of the general with various dignitaries and military leaders occupied prominent positions on his desk, and everything from his pen set to his coffee mug was arranged with geometric exactness. Behind the massive desk sat General Hawthorne, his expression cold and calculating as he gestured toward the single chair position directly in front of his workspace. "Sit down, Major Chen," he commanded, his tone leaving no doubt that this would not be a collegial discussion between military professionals. Sarah took her seat, maintaining eye contact and keeping her posture erect, determined to face whatever consequences awaited her with dignity and professional bearing. The general studied her for several long moments, as if trying to gauge her emotional state or perhaps attempting to intimidate her before beginning their conversation. "Major," he began finally, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "in my 32 years of military service, I have encountered many different types of officers. Some are natural leaders who understand the importance of discipline and hierarchy. Others are technical specialists who excel within their narrow areas of expertise. And then, there are those who mistake competence in one area for wisdom in all areas." He leaned back in his chair, his steely gaze never wavering from Sarah's face. "I'm trying to determine which category you fall into." Sarah remained silent, recognizing that any response at this point would likely be seen as argumentative or defensive. She had learned early in her military career that sometimes the best strategy was to listen carefully and respond only when directly asked a specific question. The general's approach suggested he had already reached conclusions about her character and conduct, and her primary goal now was to avoid making the situation worse. "Your record," Hawthorne continued, opening a file that Sarah recognized as her personnel folder, "shows exceptional performance in medical training, outstanding evaluations from SEAL commanders, and multiple commendations for actions under fire. He flipped through several pages, making a show of reviewing her achievements. On paper, you appear to be exactly the kind of officer the military needs. Competent, dedicated, proven in combat situations. He closed the folder with a sharp snap and leaned forward, his expression hardening. However, your conduct today reveals a fundamental character flaw that concerns me greatly. You demonstrated a complete inability to accept legitimate authority when it conflicts with your personal opinions. That kind of attitude, Major, gets people killed in combat situations. The accusation stung because Sarah knew it was fundamentally unfair. Her concerns had been based on professional medical judgment and genuine worry for the welfare of the soldiers who would be executing the mission. She had not questioned the general's authority out of arrogance or personal ambition, but out of a sense of duty to provide the best possible medical support for the personnel under her care. Sir, she began carefully, I want to clarify that my intent was never to question your authority or challenge your command decisions. As a medical officer, I felt obligated to voice concerns about patient care and casualty evacuation procedures. I understand that my approach may have been inappropriate for the setting, and I apologize for any disruption to the briefing. Hawthorne's expression remained unmoved by her explanation. Major, your intent is irrelevant. What matters is the impact of your actions on command authority and unit cohesion. When you publicly question operational decisions in front of assembled personnel, you undermine the confidence that subordinates must have in their leadership. You create doubt and hesitation at exactly the moment when decisive action is most critical. He stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the bustling activity of the airfield where personnel were already beginning preparations for the night's mission. I have led men through some of the most dangerous operations this military has ever undertaken. I have made decisions that sent soldiers into harm's way, knowing that some of them might not return. The weight of that responsibility is something that junior officers cannot fully comprehend. Sarah felt a flash of anger at the implication that she didn't understand the weight of life and death decisions. She had held dying soldiers in her arms, had made split-second choices about medical priorities while under enemy fire, had watched good men die despite her best efforts to save them. Her experience might be different from the general's, but it was no less real or significant. Sir, I have also made decisions that affected whether soldiers lived or died, she replied, her voice steady but carrying an edge of conviction. Every medical decision I make in the field has life and death implications. When I suggested alternative medical positioning, it was based on direct experience with casualty evacuation procedures in similar operational environments. The general turned from the window, his expression showing surprise that she had chosen to continue defending her position rather than simply accepting his criticism. Major, you continue to miss the fundamental point. Your experience, while valuable in its proper context, does not qualify you to redesign operational plans developed by senior commanders with strategic oversight responsibilities. He returned to his desk and picked up her personnel file again. I am recommending that you be relieved of your assignment to this operation and transferred to administrative duties pending a formal review of your conduct. Officers who cannot follow orders without argument have no place in combat operations where lives depend on immediate compliance with directives. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Being relieved of duty before a major operation would effectively end her career as a combat medic and likely result in a permanent mark on her record that would follow her for the rest of her military service. The unfairness of the punishment, given that her only crime had been trying to advocate for better medical support, made her feel sick to her stomach. Sir, she said, fighting to keep her voice steady, I respectfully request that you reconsider that recommendation. I understand that my approach today was inappropriate, and I am willing to accept whatever disciplinary action you deem appropriate. However, I believe my medical expertise could be valuable to the mission, and I am fully committed to following all orders without question. General Hawthorne studied her for a long moment, perhaps surprised by her willingness to continue fighting for her position despite the professional consequences she was facing. Major Chen, your determination is admirable, but it doesn't change the fundamental issue of your inability to accept authority. Military discipline is not negotiable. It is the foundation upon which all successful operations are built. He opened her file again and began writing notes in the margins, the scratching of his pen loud in the quiet office. I am documenting this incident and my recommendation for your reassignment. You will report to Colonel Williams in administration tomorrow morning for new duty assignments. Your replacement will be briefed on medical support requirements for tonight's operation. Sarah felt a surge of desperation as she realized that her military career was effectively ending in this moment. Everything she had worked for, all the training and experience she had gained, all the future opportunities to serve and, potentially save lives, were being swept away because she had dared to voice professional concerns about a tactical decision. General, she said, her voice carrying a note of urgency, I understand your concerns about my conduct, and I accept full responsibility for my approach today. However, I respectfully submit that relieving an experienced combat medic from duty hours before a major operation might not serve the best interests of the personnel who will be executing that mission. It was a calculated risk, essentially arguing that removing her from the operation could put other soldiers at greater risk. She knew that Hawthorne might view this as another challenge to his authority, but she also hoped that his sense of responsibility for his troops might give him pause. The general's pen stopped moving, and he looked up at her with an expression that was difficult to read. For a moment, Sarah thought she might have reached him, that his concern for the welfare of his soldiers might outweigh his anger at her perceived insubordination. The silence stretched between them as he considered her words and their implications. Finally, he set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, his expression revealing nothing of his internal deliberations. Major Chen, you present an interesting dilemma. On one hand, your medical qualifications are indeed significant, and replacing you at this late hour would require briefing another medical officer on operational specifics. On the other hand, your conduct today raises serious questions about your reliability under pressure and your willingness to follow orders without argument. Sarah remained silent, recognizing that her fate was being decided in this moment and that anything she said might tip the balance in the wrong direction. She could only hope that the general's practical considerations would outweigh his personal displeasure with her conduct. I am going to make you an offer, Major, Hawthorne said finally, his voice carrying the tone of someone presenting an ultimatum rather than a choice. You will participate in tonight's operation as planned, but under specific conditions. You will follow all directives without question or comment. You will establish the medical station at the designated coordinates and operate according to established procedures. Any deviation from orders, any attempt to implement unauthorized modifications to the medical support plan, will result in immediate court-martial proceedings. The relief Sarah felt was tempered by the recognition that she was being given one final chance to prove herself, but under conditions that would allow no room for the kind of professional judgment that had gotten her into trouble in the first place. She would be permitted to serve, but essentially as a technician following orders rather than as a medical professional contributing expertise to the operation. The night air was thick with tension and the distant sound of helicopters preparing for departure as Sarah made final preparations for the medical station. Despite the constraints placed on her by General Hawthorne, she had managed to optimize her equipment loadout and medical supplies within the parameters of her orders. The designated coordinates for the medical station were indeed farther from the action than she would have preferred, but she was determined to make the best of the situation and provide the highest quality care possible for any wounded personnel. At 0400 hours, the operation commenced with military precision. Alpha Team moved toward their breach point while Bravo Team took overwatch positions on the ridgeline. Sarah monitored radio communications from her position, listening to the steady stream of tactical updates and position reports as the assault teams approached their objective. The rescue operation was proceeding according to plan, but she knew from experience that combat situations could change in seconds. 23 minutes into the operation, everything changed. Contact, came the urgent radio transmission from Alpha Team Leader. Heavy resistance at the compound. Multiple casualties. We need immediate medical support at the breach point. Sarah's heart raced as she heard the desperation in the team leader's voice, recognizing the tone that every combat medic learned to dread. Soldiers were wounded and needed help immediately. Medical station, this is Alpha 6, the voice crackled over the radio. We have 3 urgent casualties and cannot extract to your position. The compound is surrounded by enemy forces, and we're taking heavy fire. We need you to move forward to our position for immediate treatment. The request was clear, but it directly contradicted General Hawthorne's explicit orders for Sarah to remain at the designated medical station coordinates. Sarah stared at her radio handset, knowing that the next few seconds would determine not just the fate of the wounded soldiers, but the trajectory of her entire military career. Following orders meant staying at her current position and waiting for the wounded to be brought to her, potentially costing precious minutes that could mean the difference between life and death. Disobeying orders meant moving forward to provide immediate care, but would almost certainly result in court-martial proceedings as the general had promised. The radio crackled again with increasing urgency. Medical Station, Alpha 6. One of my men is bleeding out. We cannot wait for extraction. Please advise your status and ability to move forward. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, thinking of the oath she had taken as a medical officer to preserve life above all other considerations. When she opened them again, her decision was made. Alpha 6, Medical Station, moving to your position, she transmitted, already beginning to pack her emergency medical kit. ETA 5 minutes. Mark your position with infrared strobes. Without hesitation, she abandoned the established medical station and began moving toward the compound under cover of darkness, using her night vision equipment to navigate the treacherous terrain between her position and the wounded soldiers who needed her help. The journey to Alpha Team's position required Sarah to cross nearly a mile of open ground while enemy forces were actively engaged with friendly troops. She moved with the tactical awareness that her SEAL training had ingrained in her, using available cover and concealment while carrying enough medical supplies to treat multiple casualties. The weight of her equipment was significant, but her adrenaline and sense of mission drove her forward. When she reached Alpha Team's position, the scene was chaotic. 3 soldiers lay wounded behind makeshift cover while their teammates continued to engage enemy positions around the compound perimeter. The most seriously injured was Sergeant Rodriguez, a young soldier who had taken a round through his upper thigh that had severed his femoral artery. Blood loss was severe, and, without immediate intervention, he would not survive the next few minutes. Sarah immediately went to work, applying direct pressure to the wound while establishing an 4-line for blood volume replacement. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she worked to stabilize Rodriguez while simultaneously assessing the other casualties. Private Johnson had taken shrapnel to his arm and shoulder, while Corporal Williams was suffering from a concussion and possible internal injuries from an explosion that had thrown him against a concrete wall. How long until we can extract? Sarah asked the team leader while continuing to work on Rodriguez's wounds. The tactical situation was becoming increasingly dangerous as enemy reinforcements seemed to be arriving from multiple directions. The original plan for quick extraction was no longer viable, and they would need to hold their position until additional support arrived. Unknown, came the grim reply. Enemy forces have blocked our primary and secondary extraction routes. Air support is inbound, but we're looking at potentially 30 to 40 minutes before we can move these casualties. Sarah felt her stomach tighten as she realized the implications. Keeping severely wounded soldiers stable in an active combat zone for that length of time would require resources and procedures that had not been included in the original medical support plan. Working quickly, Sarah established what amounted to a forward surgical suite in the middle of a firefight. She used the limited cover available to create a sterile treatment area and began performing emergency procedures that would normally require a fully equipped medical facility. Her SEAL training had prepared her for exactly this type of situation, but she knew that every minute they remained in their current position increased the danger for everyone involved. As Sarah worked to save Rodriguez's life, performing emergency surgery under fire while maintaining treatment for the other casualties, her radio suddenly crackled with a transmission that made everyone freeze. All units, this is actual, came General Hawthorne's voice over the command frequency. Medical Station, report your current position and status immediately. The moment Sarah had been dreading had arrived. The general had discovered that she had abandoned her assigned position to provide forward medical care, directly violating his explicit orders. Everyone within hearing distance of the radio transmission understood that they were witnessing a moment that would have profound consequences for everyone involved. Alpha Team's leader looked at Sarah with concern, recognizing that she had put her career on the line to save his men. "Medical station, Actual is requesting your position," he said quietly, offering her an opportunity to respond to the general's inquiry. Sarah continued working on Rodriguez's wounds as she considered her response, knowing that whatever she said next would seal her fate. "Actual, medical station," she finally transmitted, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Currently providing emergency medical care to 3 urgent casualties at Alpha Team's position. Unable to extract casualties to designated medical station due to enemy contact and severity of injuries." Her transmission was factual and professional, but everyone who heard it understood that she had just admitted to directly disobeying the general's orders. The silence that followed her transmission seemed to last forever. In the background, the sounds of combat continued as Alpha Team maintained their defensive perimeter while Sarah worked frantically to stabilize the wounded soldiers. Rodriguez's condition was improving, but he still required constant monitoring and treatment to prevent him from bleeding out. When General Hawthorne's voice finally came back over the radio, it carried a tone that was difficult to interpret. "Medical station, explain your decision to abandon your assigned position against direct orders." The question was clearly intended to give Sarah an opportunity to provide justification for her actions, but everyone listening understood that no justification would likely be sufficient to avoid serious consequences. Sarah paused in her treatment of Johnson's shrapnel wounds and keyed her radio. "Actual, faced with multiple urgent casualties who could not be extracted to the medical station due to enemy action, I made the decision to move forward to provide immediate life-saving care. Sergeant Rodriguez would not have survived transport to the designated medical station given the severity of his arterial bleeding." Her response was clinically accurate and professionally delivered, but it was also a clear acknowledgement that she had prioritized her medical judgment over following orders. Around the defensive perimeter, Alpha Team members listened to the exchange while continuing to engage enemy forces, all of them acutely aware that the medic who was saving their wounded teammates was simultaneously ending her own career. The radio remained silent for several minutes as General Hawthorne processed Sarah's explanation and considered his response. During this time, Sarah continued providing medical care while the tactical situation around them gradually improved as air support arrived and began engaging enemy positions. The immediate danger to the wounded soldiers was decreasing, but the professional danger to Sarah was only beginning. Finally, the general's voice returned to the radio, and when he spoke, there was something different in his tone. "Medical station, what is the current status of casualties?" The question was straightforward and focused on the medical situation rather than the disciplinary issues that everyone expected him to address. "Actual, 3 casualties stabilized and prepared for extraction," Sarah reported. "Sergeant Rodriguez required emergency surgery for femoral artery repair and has received 2 units of blood replacement. Private Johnson and Corporal Williams have been treated for shrapnel wounds and concussion respectively. All casualties are stable for transport when extraction becomes available." Another long silence followed her medical report. Then, unexpectedly, General Hawthorne's voice came back with a tone that no one had anticipated. "Medical station, well done. Ensure casualties are prepared for helicopter extraction. Bird inbound to your position in 10 minutes. The simple acknowledgement sent shockwaves through everyone who heard it. Instead of the disciplinary action that everyone expected, the general had praised Sarah's medical performance. Alpha Team members looked at each other in surprise, while Sarah continued her medical work, unsure of what the general's response meant for her future but focused on ensuring her patients were ready for transport. As the extraction helicopter approached their position, Sarah realized that something fundamental had changed in the dynamic between herself and General Hawthorne. The silence that had fallen across the radio frequency was not the silence of disapproval or impending punishment, but something else entirely. Something that would only become clear in the hours and days that followed, as the full implications of the night's events were assessed and analyzed by the command structure. For now, Sarah focused on her patients, ensuring they were properly secured for transport while reflecting on the strange turn of events that had transformed what should have been a career-ending confrontation into something altogether different. The silence that had fallen across the command frequency carried with it the weight of recognition, respect, and perhaps the beginning of a new understanding between a stubborn medic and an equally stubborn general.